So you now know how to register outputs either with the output decorator or with help of that output function I showed you in the previous lecture. One thing I want to note about this output decorator approach here, which I'm using here, is that if you're using it and if you're therefore creating that event emitter object manually like this, you can still actually add such a generic type assignment here by adding angle brackets after event emitter before those parentheses, just as we did it earlier with the input function, for example, or with the output function in the last lecture, to let TypeScript and therefore Angular know about the type of value you'll be emitting. Now, it technically isn't required here. I'm not getting an error if I don't add it. But this also allows me to emit any kind of value without problems. I could, for example, emit a number here. That, however, would be problematic because in my app component, where onSelectUser is triggered, I'm expecting to get a string value. And therefore, I might want to add that extra layer of security and make it very clear that I do plan to emit a string value. If I then accidentally, or one of my colleagues accidentally, emit a number, I get an error here, as you can tell. And that's why you might want to consider adding that generic type definition here, even if it's technically not required. Now, I'm not doing it here, but you could add it for extra type safety, and that's just something to be aware of. Now that you learned a lot about inputs and outputs and how to build and use components, it's time for a little exercise. And my exercise for you is that you should replace this text here with a separate component, a tasks component, which receives and outputs the name of the user that is selected. Now keep in mind that we are getting the information which user is selected here in the app component. And it's also here in the app component where you should then add this tasks component, which you should build for this exercise here. So that you then output your tasks component here. Of course, it doesn't exist yet at this point, but you should build and output it. And you should then pass the username to this component. You don't have to worry about styling or about any other features, but that's now an exercise for you. I'll give you a couple of seconds to pause the video and try this on your own, and thereafter we'll implement this together. So, did you succeed? Let's try this together. And for that, I'll start by creating a new component. And I will do that with help of the Angular CLI, though you could of course also do it manually. But I'll generate a new component with ng-gc, and I'll then name it tasks. Now here's also a little trick. You can add --skip--tests to make sure that this testing file is not being generated, because we don't need it here. Alternatively, we could of course also simply delete it. But this will not create it in the first place, and with that, therefore, I now got this tasks folder with those tasks component files. And now it's in this tasks component HTML file where I want to output the username. For example, in an h2 element, but it's totally up to you how you structured this and how you output this. That's not what this exercise is about. Now for that, of course, we need to get the name of the user that should be output. And since we have that information, which user is selected in the app component, that means that in the tasks component, where we need that information, we have to accept an input. So we should import this input decorator and add a new input property. And that could now be the entire user. It could be the user ID, and of course the name is up to you. And we could then use that ID to select the user from that dummy users array. But of course, it could also just be the name of the user, and that's what I'll accept here. Now that should be a string, and I know that I will get it, but to ensure that I will get it, I will add this configuration object and set this to a required input. Now with that, we can go to this tasks component HTML file, and then there use string interpolation to output that name. And that's all we have to do in this component. Now in the app component HTML file, I'm already trying to use the tasks component, but of course here I'm getting an error that this is not a known element. Now I can use this quick fix to automatically add it to the imports array, or you can do this manually. Either way, you have to make sure that in the app components imports array here, in the component decorator, this tasks component is added. And to be able to add it here, it also must be imported here at the top of the file. Now in the app component template, we of course want to set this name property. And I want to set it to a dynamic value because it will change whenever we select a different user. Now for that, of course, as a first step in the app component class here, we have to make sure that we store that information which user is selected. So we could add a selected user or maybe a selected user ID property, whatever you want. And initially set this to U1, for example, if we're storing that ID, to initially store the first user. Now here in onSelectUser, instead of console logging which user was selected, we can set this selected user ID equal to that ID we're receiving as a parameter. Now, of course, in the template, we don't need the ID, but instead the name of the selected user. But we can now compute this by adding another property here, a getter property with the get keyword, which could be the selected user, so that we also practice the usage of computed values. And here I want to return this users, which is my list of all the users. And then I want to find the user with this ID. And find, of course, is a method that's built into JavaScript. It's not Angular or TypeScript specific. Instead, find allows us to, well, find a specific element in an array of elements. For that, find takes a function as an input, and that function then itself receives an input, which is the user it's currently looking at, because this function here will be executed for all the elements in that array, and it will then receive the individual element it's currently evaluating as an input. And we then have to return true if that's the element we were looking for, or false otherwise. And therefore I want to return true if the ID of the user I'm currently looking at in that array of users, if that's equal to the selected user ID. And that's how we could dynamically compute the selected user and find that selected user. And therefore now, of course, back in the app component template, we can use property binding here on name to set this equal to the selected user, and then there the name. Now you see, I now actually get an error here, and TypeScript added this question mark here automatically. Now I'll get back to that in the next lectures. For the moment, I'll actually remove it and change the code in the app component here a little bit, and I'll add an exclamation mark here after this find operation. Because the problem TypeScript had with this code here before was that it's of course possible that we don't find a user at all, and that find therefore returns undefined as a value. And the tasks component does not want some undefined value, and that would have been a problem. By adding this exclamation mark here, I'm again convincing TypeScript that this will never be the case, that we'll always find a user for the selected user ID, and that everything will be fine. Again, I'll get back to this and how we could improve this code in the next lectures. For the moment, we can leave it like this. And if you now save everything, you should have an application where you can switch between those users and the respective username is being output here. And that's therefore this exercise solved. Now, if you were not able to solve this on your own, or if you got a different solution, which is very likely, that is absolutely fine. It's just about practicing what we learned, and we're still pretty early in this course. You'll receive plenty of other practice opportunities, and we'll dive into many more demo projects and exercises later in this course. No worries.